You felt it before you named it. That tiny pause, so small it almost doesn't count as a decision. When your thumb hovers over the scroll, when a part of you is already moving on and another part of you is still here. It isn't dramatic. It doesn't arrive with thunder or a voice in the ceiling. It arrives like a hairline crack in momentum. Like the world hesitates with you for half a breath. And if you're honest, it isn't the first time. There are moments when information doesn't feel like information. It feels like a door handle you didn't mean to touch. A sentence that reaches past your taste and preferences and hits something older, something that doesn't want to be disturbed. In those moments, you can almost watch your mind reach for an exit. Not because you're bored, not because the content is bad, but because the content is too close to the place where you keep your life assembled. This is where the myth and the mind meet. In the old stories, Thoth is the keeper of measures, the scribe who records, the god of language and numbers, the one who understands the machinery behind what humans call fate. In the temples, he is not a mascot for trivia. He is the intelligence that organizes reality into symbols you can carry. And the strange thing about symbols is that they do not need to shout. They do not need to win arguments. They only need to land. That is why the first battlefield is never out there in the world. It is in the instant you decide whether to keep watching. Because there is a reflex, quiet, automatic, almost polite, that tries to save you from being changed. It does not announce itself as fear. It rarely shows up wearing the costume of panic. It shows up as an impulse towards something else. A sudden need to check your phone. A thought that says, this is probably nonsense. A little itch in your body that suggests you should stand up, get water, do something productive, anything that restores your familiar shape. That is the reflex this entire passage has been pointing to, the skip reflex. Not as an insult, not as a weakness, as a function. Imagine, for a moment, that your identity is a city with gates. You have rules, routines, preferences, beliefs, structures that let you move through your days without collapsing under the weight of choice. You call that stability. Your nervous system calls it safety. Your ego calls it me. And those gates are guarded, not by soldiers with spears, but by habits and interpretations, patterns that decide what is worth attention and what must be dismissed to keep you coherent. Most of the time, those guards are useful. Without them, you'd be swallowed by the infinite. You would be struck dumb by too many possibilities. You would walk around raw and porous, absorbing everything, unable to choose. The guards keep you efficient. They keep you recognizable. They keep you consistent. But when a piece of information carries the power to remap your inner world, the guards don't evaluate it like a calm librarian. They react like a border patrol. They do not ask, is this true? They ask, will this change you? And if the answer is yes, the alarms begin. Here is the uncomfortable part. The alarms often sound like your own voice. That's what makes it so hard to see. The mind produces a perfectly reasonable thought. I don't have time. This is exaggerated. I've heard this before. This is too woo-woo. This person is just trying to hook me. And it feels like discernment. It feels like intelligence. It feels like you're being smart. But sometimes it is not discernment. Sometimes it is defense. Not defense against lies, but defense against transformation. Because transformation is not only change in opinion. It is change in identity. And identity does not relinquish control politely. Identity is a structure designed to survive. It wants predictability. It wants continuity. It wants to keep yesterday's version of you alive inside today's body. It wants you to wake up and recognize yourself. So when a message arrives that threatens to upgrade your operating system, the identity reacts with what looks like boredom but feels like physical gravity. A pull away. A pressure to return to baseline. The skip reflex doesn't need to defeat the message. It only needs to break the contact. Just break eye contact with the truth, and it loses its power. You've seen this in yourself, even if you've never said it out loud. You can watch hours of light entertainment with ease, but the moment a conversation gets too real, too close to the decisions you've been avoiding, you become restless. You suddenly remember emails. You suddenly need to clean. You suddenly need to research something unrelated. Your mind becomes creative in the way only a threatened mind can be. And the strangest detail is that part of you is aware of it while it's happening. There's a thin, sharp moment when you feel the urge to scroll, and you also feel, faintly, that scrolling would be running. That is why you feel torn. That is why the hesitation matters. The hesitation is not indecision. It is the scene between two versions of you. The one who protects what's familiar, and the one who is tired of the familiar protecting you into a smaller life. This is why the text frames your pause as a threshold. Not because you are special in a flattering way, but because this mechanism is universal. There are always two forces operating when something important approaches. The force that wants to remain intact, and the force that wants to become more true. Call them ego and soul if you like. Call them conditioning and awareness. Call them fear and curiosity. The names do not matter. The experience is the same. The pull to escape and the pull to stay. Now, in the mythology, Thoth is not a motivational speaker. He doesn't beg you to believe. He records. He measures. He shows you the pattern. And the pattern begins with this simple insight. The most dangerous lie is not "this is false." The most dangerous lie is "this is irrelevant." If the mind can label a message irrelevant, it doesn't have to fight it. It can walk away with dignity. It can scroll past without guilt. It can keep its self-image as a rational person who is not easily influenced. It can keep the ego's crown polished. So the ego tries to make you feel above it, above the mystery, above the possibility that you might be missing something. It's subtle. It's elegant. And it works on most people. Because if you are told you're resisting, your mind can protest. It can argue. It can prove its innocence. But if you simply scroll away, there is no debate. The guard wins quietly. The gate stays shut. The city stays the same. And yet, you didn't scroll. Or at least, you haven't yet. That matters because attention is not neutral. Attention is a form of consent. The moment you give sustained attention to something, you are allowing it to touch your mind. You are allowing it to rearrange something, even slightly. This is why the skip reflex shows up as the first line of defense. It tries to interrupt consent before consent becomes contact, and before contact becomes change. If you want to see how automatic it is, watch your own body as you listen to something that threatens your worldview. The shoulders tighten. The jaw shifts. The breath becomes shallow. There is often a tiny surge of energy, almost like agitation, that demands movement. It can feel like impatience. It can feel like skepticism. But underneath it, there is often a simple truth your body is revealing. A part of you senses consequence. Because if this message is true, or even partly true, something in your life would have to move. And movement is expensive. Movement costs identity. It costs relationships. It costs habits. It costs the comfort of being certain. Even positive change carries a price, because it means leaving behind a version of yourself you've been using as shelter. The mind knows this, not philosophically, but practically. The mind knows that growth is not just insight. Growth is decision. Growth is behavior. Growth is losing the right to keep pretending you didn't know. So the skip reflex arrives before the knowledge becomes binding. It arrives in that crucial moment when you could still claim ignorance, when you could still say, "I never really looked into it," when you could still keep your life on the rails you already know. This is the moment the mythology dramatizes as a test. Not a moral test, whether you are good or bad. A structural test, whether you are ready to tolerate a larger reality. Because a larger reality is always harder to maintain. It asks more of your honesty. It asks more of your courage. It asks more of your willingness to stand alone when your old circle doesn't understand. It asks more of your ability to live with uncertainty while you rebuild your map. So the guard tries a different tactic. It makes the message feel heavy. It makes the message feel like effort. It makes the message feel like work. That is why, in the text you provided, the resistance is described almost as a physical aversion. Not because a ghost is attacking you, but because your nervous system is a living archive of survival strategies. Your threat detection system is ancient. It evolved to keep you alive in a world where the wrong choice meant blood. And the most primitive parts of you do not understand paradigm shift. They understand risk. A new idea that demands a new life is risk. So your system reacts. And if you've ever wondered why you can feel your attention slipping right when something starts to resonate, why you get sleepy at the edge of insight, why you become restless at the edge of truth, this is the first answer. Your identity has a security system, and it has been trained to treat transformation as danger. That is why Thoth, in this framing, knows you're about to skip. Because the mechanism is predictable. Not because he is spying on you from a tomb. Because humans have always done this at thresholds. We lean toward the door, and then, at the last second, we find a reason to walk away. We call it practicality. We call it cynicism. We call it being busy. But it is often the same ancient move. Flee the moment that might change you. And still you are here. So, for the rest of this journey, hold this as your first instrument. Not belief, not skepticism, but observation. You don't have to swallow anything. You don't have to worship anything. You only have to notice, in real time, what happens in you when you approach something that carries weight. Notice the impulse to escape. Notice the story your mind tells to justify escape. Notice the small bodily signals that accompany it. Because the moment you can see the skip reflex, you're no longer fully owned by it. And that is the first crack in the gate. Once you notice the skip reflex, you start to realize something unsettling. It isn't random at all. It has timing. It has patterns. It shows up with a kind of discipline, like a trained animal that knows exactly when to bare its teeth. And in the old language of temples, this is the moment you will be told to stop thinking of resistance as a vague mood and start treating it as a system. Not a supernatural system. Not a conspiracy in the shadows. A system inside you, built from memory, survival, and identity, whose job is to keep the you know from dissolving into something unfamiliar. This is why the mythic framing matters. Thoth is the scribe, the one who measures. He is not impressed by your excuses. He is not seduced by your opinions. He watches what happens when your inner world touches a threshold, and he names the alarms so you can hear them. Because here's the trick. Resistance is easiest to obey when you can't recognize it. The moment it has a shape, it loses some of its spell. The first alarm is the one that confuses people the most, because it arrives wearing the costume of boredom. It feels like your attention simply fizzles out. You're watching something that is actually opening doors in your mind. You can feel connections forming. You can feel your perception stretching. And suddenly, as if someone turned the lights down, your system tries to shut it all off. You get sleepy, restless, irritated. You want to move, to snack, to check messages, to do anything that drops you back into your usual groove. This isn't laziness. It isn't lack of discipline. It's your baseline fighting to stay the baseline. If you've ever had a moment where you learned something and it changed the way you saw your life, really changed it, you know there's a physiological aspect to it. Your body doesn't just understand it. Your body adjusts. Your breathing changes. Your posture changes. Your attention becomes sharper, almost too sharp. It's like the inside of you is tuning to a different station. That shift has a cost, and your nervous system notices the cost before your intellect makes sense of it. The most ancient parts of your brain are built to treat sudden changes in internal state as potential danger. It doesn't matter that the danger is in sight. The circuitry is old. It scans for instability. It flags the shift. So the alarm triggers a return to baseline response. The simplest way to return to baseline is distraction. The skip reflex is not just avoidance. It is regulation. It's your system trying to restabilize itself by pulling you back into the familiar rhythms that have kept you functional for years. That's why it can feel almost physical, like a gravity that leans you away from the edge of your own expansion. The second alarm is sharper, less sleepy, more defensive. This one appears when a belief you rely on is about to break. Most people underestimate how much of their life is built from assumptions. Not thoughtful, carefully tested beliefs, assumptions. The silent things you take for granted so you can move through the day without questioning every step. You assume certain people are safe. You assume certain paths are realistic. You assume the world works in a way that makes your choices feel sensible. And those assumptions aren't just ideas. They're load-bearing beams. They hold up your identity. When information arrives that threatens to crack one of those beams, the mind doesn't respond like a philosopher. It responds like a homeowner hearing a loud snap in the ceiling. There's a flash of urgency, a need to reject the source, a sudden wave of anger that feels righteous even when you can't explain it, or a rush of practical thoughts, things you must do immediately, anything to move away from the moment before the beam gives way. This is why people can sit for hours in effortless consumption, but cannot endure 20 minutes of something that challenges their worldview. Entertainment does not threaten the architecture. It can be enjoyed without consequence. But a message that demands you rebuild your reality comes with a hidden invoice. If I accept this, then what else changes? If I accept this, what does it say about the choices I've made? If I accept this, what do I lose? The ego answers quickly. You lose comfort, you lose certainty, you lose the right to keep living the same life without friction. So it deploys the alarm. And again, the alarm is clever. It rarely says, I'm scared. It says, this is stupid. It says, this isn't for me. It says, I don't trust this person. Sometimes, it even says, I already know this. That last one is especially dangerous because it can be true on the surface and still be a perfect escape hatch. You can know something intellectually and still be untouched by it. You can know it in theory and never let it rearrange your behavior. The ego loves knowledge that doesn't require change. It loves ideas that flatter the mind while leaving the life intact. So when a belief is near collapse, the ego reaches for the fastest weapon, dismissal. The third alarm is quieter, stranger, and it often arrives with a feeling that is hard to admit without sounding irrational. It's the experience of recognition. You hear something you've never studied, and yet you feel it in your bones. You encounter a concept you couldn't have logically formed, and yet something inside you nods. Not enthusiastically, but inevitably, like an old memory resurfacing. This is where the text you gave uses the language of dormant memory. Past lives, ancestral memory, suppressed insight. Choose the frame you can tolerate. The experience itself is the key, a familiarity that makes no sense. And familiarity should feel comforting. But this kind of familiarity can feel threatening because it implies something else, that you have been living below what you know. If a truth feels like recognition, then the question becomes, why did I forget? And beneath that, what have I been pretending not to see? That's why the third alarm often comes with a strange blend of attraction and revulsion. The content pulls you closer, and the skip reflex flares at the same time. It's as if your deeper self is reaching for the message while your conditioned self panics. Because remembering is not neutral. Remembering is an accusation against your current life. It suggests you've settled. It suggests you've complied. It suggests you've played small. And even if none of that is morally bad, it is still destabilizing. So the ego rushes in with ridicule. It tries to poison the experience of recognition by labeling it nonsense. It tries to shame you out of your own intuition. It tries to restore the hierarchy, logic on the throne, instinct in the basement. This is why people who experience deep resonance often immediately undercut themselves. They laugh. They change the subject. They minimize. They scroll. Not because the recognition isn't real to them, because it is too real. The fourth alarm is the most primal of all. It doesn't need language. It is simply the body responding as if a predator entered the room. This is egopanic. Not ego as vanity. Ego as continuity. Ego as the system that keeps you from dissolving into 1,000 contradictory selves. Ego as survival structure. When ego panic hits, it can look like anxiety, but it isn't necessarily fear of the content. It's fear of what the content implies. Fear that you will become someone who cannot go back. Fear that you will see too much to keep tolerating what you've been tolerating. Fear that you will have to act. And action is where things become irreversible. This is why ego panic often shows up right before someone makes a major move, leaves a job, ends a relationship, starts a creative project, commits to a new discipline, finally tells the truth. The closer they get, the more intense the resistance becomes because the ego senses the cliff edge. It cannot tell whether stepping off the cliff leads to death or flight. It only knows the old self won't survive unchanged. So the alarm fires, and the body responds with fight, flight, or freeze. Your heart rate shifts. Your chest tightens. Your thoughts scatter. You suddenly feel the need to do something, anything that restores control. Sometimes the control is arguing. Sometimes the control is cynicism. Sometimes the control is distraction. Sometimes the control is shutting down completely. And this is where the ancient framing becomes almost brutally practical. The ego cannot distinguish between a saber-toothed tiger and a paradigm-shifting idea. The same threat circuitry lights up. The same survival programming activates. The body prepares to protect the existing identity as if it were the body itself. So now you can see the deeper pattern. These alarms are not random flaws in you. They are programmed responses to instability. They have kept you alive in a world where instability often meant danger. They are competent. They are efficient. They are also outdated for the kind of evolution you're being asked to live. Because your greatest dangers now are not claws in the dark. They are small, daily betrayals of your own knowing. They are the slow suffocation of routines you've outgrown. They are the quiet erosion of your integrity when you keep choosing what is familiar over what is true. And this is why Thoth, in this mythology, doesn't curse the ego. He doesn't call it evil. He simply teaches you to watch it the way a navigator watches weather. When the alarms fire, you don't panic and turn back automatically. You read the signal. You notice which alarm is sounding in you right now. Is it the drowsy pull of baseline trying to restore itself? Is it the sharp defensiveness of belief collapse? Is it the uncanny discomfort of recognition, something old returning? Or is it ego panic, the body acting as if transformation were a threat? Because the moment you can name the alarm, you gain a thin wedge of choice. Not a dramatic, heroic choice. A small one. The choice to stay present for 3 more breaths. The choice to feel the impulse to flee without obeying it. The choice to ask quietly without theatrics, what is this trying to protect? And if you keep asking that, with patience, you begin to discover something that feels almost like a secret the world has been hiding in plain sight. The resistance doesn't show up when you're wasting your life. It shows up when you're approaching the edge of something that could actually change it. And here's the strange twist, the one that makes the whole mechanism feel less like a prison and more like a map. The same inner system that pulls you away from truth also reveals where truth is trying to find you. Because the skip reflex doesn't only appear when something is spiritual or mysterious. It appears whenever something carries consequence. Whenever a message could actually alter the way you see your life, your relationships, your next decisions. In that sense, resistance becomes a kind of spotlight. It marks the places where meaning is concentrated. But once you accept that, you run straight into the problem that modern life makes almost unavoidable. Most guidance doesn't look like guidance. We've been trained by movies, by myth taken too literally, by the drama-hungry part of the mind, to expect that if reality is trying to communicate with us, it will do it in a way that cannot be ignored. A booming voice, a prophetic dream, a lightning bolt of certainty that removes all doubt. And yet, the deeper pattern is almost the opposite. The most consequential messages rarely arrive with spectacle. They arrive like whispers that could be dismissed without penalty. That's what makes them so easy to miss. Reality doesn't force your attention. It invites it. It respects your sovereignty too much to drag you by the collar. So what does guidance actually look like? It looks ordinary enough that you can explain it away, and precise enough that you feel in your body when it happens. It looks like a moment in the middle of a normal day, standing in a line, walking through a parking lot, washing a cup, when something you overhear slides into you with the clean click of a key turning in a lock. You didn't go looking for it. You weren't even in a spiritual mood. But suddenly, a sentence enters your mind and stays there like it found its home. It looks like a book you open without thinking, and the page you land on answers the question you haven't told anyone you're carrying. It looks like a song that comes on at the exact wrong time to be coincidence and the exact right time to be useful. It looks like the same number pattern repeating so often that your logical mind starts to feel embarrassed for noticing. And yet something keeps noticing anyway, because the repetition has weight. Guidance, in this framing, travels through the seams of the everyday. It slips in where your guard is relaxed. It bypasses the part of you that wants to manage the story and lands in the part of you that recognizes, quietly, that this matters. And the key word is recognize. Not believe, not worship, not accept everything. Recognize. Recognition is different from agreement. It's different from persuasion. It's an internal resonance that occurs before you have an argument for it. Your body knows before your mouth does. Your attention sharpens. Your breath changes. Something in you leans forward. You might even feel a small pressure behind the eyes, as if your perception is trying to focus on something it can't fully name. The passage you shared describes multiple pathways for this recognition to happen, and what's important is not the metaphysical explanation, but the pattern. Meaning repeats until it is heard. Sometimes it repeats as subtle cues in the environment. It's not that the world becomes a coded puzzle for you to obsess over. It's that your awareness becomes sensitive enough to notice that certain moments carry a particular kind of emphasis. Light hits your room in a way that feels like an underscore beneath your thoughts. An animal appears at an unlikely time, and it mirrors something shifting in your life. A phrase you haven't heard in years suddenly shows up in 3 different places within the same week. A skeptical mind will say, "You're just noticing patterns." And that may be true, but there's a deeper question hiding underneath that skepticism. Why these patterns and why now? Because not every pattern grabs you. Not every coincidence stays in your mind. Most of what you see in a day passes through you like wind. But certain things linger. Certain things stick. Certain things have a kind of gravity. That lingering is part of the signal. There's another way guidance slips through, and it can feel almost absurdly simple. Accidental messages. The kind you were never supposed to hear. The kind that arrive through timing rather than intention. You overhear a stranger's conversation, and it speaks directly to the boundary you've been failing to set. You hear 2 people discussing something mundane, and suddenly you realize you've been negotiating with your own life in the same way, quietly, unconsciously, without courage. The mind calls it random, but your nervous system reacts as if it were delivered. And the difference matters, because randomness doesn't rearrange you. A delivered message does, even if you don't know who sent it. Then there are synchronicities, and this is where the line between ordinary and mysterious starts to blur, because synchronicity isn't just coincidence. It's coincidence with relevance. It's the way events mirror your inner state with a precision that feels intimate. You think of someone you haven't spoken to in years, and they contact you that day. You are considering a major change, and, without trying, you encounter the same theme in unrelated places, different voices, different sources, same instruction. A modern mind will try to flatten this into psychology. Confirmation bias, selective attention, pattern seeking, and again, that may be part of it. But even if it is, the practical question remains, what do you do with it? Because if you reduce every signal to a trick of the brain, you eliminate the possibility of being guided by anything deeper than habit. You become locked into a worldview where meaning is always accidental, where resonance is always suspect, where life is a machine and you are alone inside it. The text you gave is pushing back against that loneliness. It insists that life answers when you're ready to hear, not in slogans, in patterns. And it makes a crucial distinction. Coincidences feel disconnected, like noise. Synchronicities feel connected like threads. They carry emotional weight and practical use. They don't just make you say, "That's weird." They make you say, quietly, "That's for me." If you've ever felt that, you know it's different. It's not superstition. It's an internal click of relevance. It's your attention being gripped by something you didn't choose to grip you. Another channel is even subtler, phrases that linger. Someone says a sentence in passing, almost carelessly, and it refuses to leave you. You hear it when you wash your hands. You hear it when you lie down. You hear it when you try to distract yourself. It echoes, not as anxiety, but as insistence. And the more you try to dismiss it, the more it stays, because the staying is the point. A phrase that lingers is not always profound. Sometimes it's almost annoyingly simple. Tell the truth. Stop delaying. Choose what you actually want. Trust the process. The mind wants complexity. The soul wants clarity. The mind wants to debate. The soul wants to move. So the phrase becomes a pressure, not to entertain it, but to integrate it. And finally, there's the channel that is most humbling because it reveals how often guidance arrives disguised as distraction, content you almost scroll past. Not because it's magical content, but because it arrives at the intersection of timing and readiness. You weren't searching for it. You were on your way somewhere else, mentally, emotionally, algorithmically, and yet something in you paused. This is why the passage frames your pause as meaningful. It is not saying the universe is obsessed with your YouTube feed. It is saying that recognition can be triggered through any doorway, and the doorway is less important than what walks through it. Now, none of this works if your awareness is constantly being shredded by noise. And that's the harsh truth the text keeps circling. Modern life doesn't just distract you from deep messages. It trains you to mistrust your ability to perceive them. It trains you to assume that anything subtle is imaginary. It trains you to live at a speed where the whisper cannot be heard. So the practical practice is not to become mystical. It is to become quiet enough to notice. The text recommends what it calls recognition windows, small moments that are not formal meditation, not a ritual performance, not an attempt to force revelation. Just 5 minutes where you slow down and let your senses report. You notice what thoughts keep returning. You notice what catches your attention in the environment. You notice what you would normally miss because you're moving too fast. And when something catches, you apply a simple test. Why did that linger? Not what does it mean in an obsessive way. Not what is the universe trying to say with a desperate hunger. Just why did that stay with me? Because the answer to that question often reveals what your conscious mind is avoiding. It reveals what your life is trying to bring into focus. Then comes the discipline that turns the whole thing from vague mysticism into something you can actually work with, documentation. Not because you need to prove anything to anyone, because the mind forgets, the mind dismisses, the mind rationalizes. But when you write down the moments that carry weight, the repeating numbers, the unexpected conversations, the coincidences that feel like threads, you begin to see patterns over time. And when you see patterns over time, you start to realize you've been in a conversation with life longer than you thought. Maybe the conversation was always there, and you were always too busy to hear it. Maybe the mystery isn't hidden. Maybe it's simply quiet. So the question shifts. It's no longer, is guidance real? In the abstract. The question becomes, are you willing to live as if your attention matters? Because your attention is the gateway. Your attention is the altar. Whatever you consistently give it to becomes your reality. If you give it to endless noise, your life becomes static. If you give it to what lingers, your life begins to organize around meaning. And this is where the earlier alarms start to make more sense. The inner authority doesn't only resist transformation. It resists the quiet required to perceive transformation. It prefers stimulation because stimulation keeps you from hearing yourself. It prefers speed because speed prevents recognition. It prefers constant input because constant input makes every message feel like just another message. But the moment you slow down enough to notice, the whisper becomes audible. Not as a command, not as a prophecy, as a gentle, persistent resonance that says, pay attention here. And once you can hear the whisper, the next thing you notice is even stranger. You're not just being worn away. You're being pulled in, not in a loud, dramatic way, not as a command, more like gravity, more like a tide. You didn't plan to care about this, and yet something in you keeps returning to it, circling it, testing it from different angles the way an animal tests the air before stepping into a clearing. That's the part most people don't know how to explain, so they pretend it isn't happening. They call it algorithm luck. They call it curiosity. They call it procrastination. But if you've ever been honest with yourself, you know there's a particular kind of pull that doesn't feel like entertainment. It feels like contact. It feels like the world found a way to press on a place inside you that has been waiting to be pressed. And it's rarely comfortable, because the pull tends to show up right where the skip reflex lives. It's the same intersection, attraction and avoidance, recognition and resistance. The part of you that wants to keep scrolling and the part of you that, for reasons it can't defend in court, wants to stay. This is where the old stories about Thoth become more than decoration. They become a lens. Not because you need to believe in a feathered god whispering through your phone, but because the archetype is describing a psychological experience with unnerving accuracy. There are moments when your inner life reaches a threshold, and suddenly you become magnetized toward exactly the information that could shift you. And the magnetism has a signature. The first signature is what the text calls magnetic curiosity. It's that irrational draw towards something your logical mind can't justify. You weren't looking for it. You weren't into it. It wasn't on your to-do list. And yet, here you are leaning in. Not because you already agree, but because something in you wants to know. It's a curiosity with weight. A curiosity that doesn't feel like browsing. It feels like being summoned, quietly, gently, but persistently. Magnetic curiosity is different from ordinary curiosity in one important way. Ordinary curiosity feels optional. Magnetic curiosity feels like it will follow you if you try to escape it. You can scroll away, but it stays in your peripheral vision. You can shut the tab, but you keep thinking about one sentence. You can tell yourself it's not practical, and still, something in you returns to it later, as if it's checking whether the door is still there. This is why the passage uses the metaphor of migrating birds sensing a magnetic field. You don't need that metaphor to be literally true to understand the experience. There are internal fields in a human life, pressures and pulls created by readiness, by unmet truth, by a growing mismatch between who you are and how you're living. When that mismatch reaches a certain intensity, your attention starts to behave differently. It begins to seek what can resolve the tension, not what is comforting, what is clarifying. That's why you can find yourself drawn to a book you randomly notice, a teacher you randomly hear about, a topic you randomly can't stop thinking about. The randomness is often just the part you can't track. But the pull? The pull is traceable in your body. It has a texture. It's a forward lean of the mind. And then comes the second signature, the one that tends to embarrass people because it doesn't sound spiritual at all. It's irritation, not calm disagreement, not thoughtful critique. A specific irritation that flares when something challenges a belief you've been using as a pillow. The text calls it productive irritation, and that phrase matters because it separates two different kinds of annoyance. There's annoyance that comes from nonsense, something sloppy, false, manipulative. That kind of annoyance wants to leave, and leaving is healthy. But productive irritation is different. It's the sting of being touched on a bruise you didn't admit you had. It's the discomfort of having your story questioned by a fact you don't want to integrate. The clue is what you do next. When something is truly useless to you, you forget it. You don't keep wrestling with it. You don't keep returning to it. You don't feel compelled to prove it wrong. You simply move on because your system doesn't register it as relevant. But productive irritation makes you hover. It makes you argue in your head. It makes you replay the sentence. It makes you want to comment, to correct, to refute, and yet you're still listening. This is where the ego's strategy is obvious once you see it. The ego doesn't always try to stop you by making you bored. Sometimes it tries to stop you by making you angry. Because anger feels like power. Anger feels like control. Anger keeps you from softening into recognition. If you stay irritated, you can keep your identity intact. You can keep your worldview unchallenged. You can keep your position as the rational observer who doesn't get seduced by ideas. But beneath productive irritation, there is usually a quieter truth. Something is being dismantled. Something you used to rely on is becoming unreliable. And the ego reacts the way it always reacts when a familiar structure starts to wobble. It tries to reassert authority. This is why a person can mock a concept and still binge it. This is why someone can call something ridiculous and still keep coming back. Because the irritation isn't only resistance, it's also contact. It's the friction of your old map rubbing against a new territory. Now, the third signature is more intimate, and it often feels like a pause inside the mind, a small stutter in your certainty. The text calls it recognition hesitation. And you know at the moment it happens because there's a split second where you think, almost against your will, that makes sense. It's not a full conversion. It's not surrender. It's a flash of alignment. A sentence lands, and part of you agrees before you have time to assemble your defenses. And then, immediately, the defense arrives. The reasons, the caveats, the skepticism, the internal attorney who starts cross-examining the moment. This back and forth is not random. It's the sensation of two intelligences negotiating inside you. One is the intelligence of your conditioning, what you've learned to accept, what you've learned to dismiss, what you've learned to call realistic. The other is the intelligence of recognition, your capacity to feel when something is relevant even before you can explain why. Recognition hesitation is what happens when the second intelligence speaks up and the first one panics. And the panic is not always mental. Often it's physical. You feel a tightening in your chest, a flutter in your stomach, a sudden heat in your face, sometimes even a faint dizziness, not because you're in danger, but because you're recalibrating. A new idea is trying to install itself, and your internal system is checking compatibility. This is where people make a mistake that costs them years. They treat the discomfort as proof the message is wrong. But discomfort is not a truth detector. Discomfort is often just a change detector. If you've lived at one emotional temperature for a long time, a shift feels like alarm even when it's healing. If you've lived inside one identity for years, expansion feels like threat even when it's freedom. So recognition hesitation becomes the fork in the road of attention. You can obey the defense and scroll away, preserving coherence. Or you can stay with the wobble, letting your system adjust. Not forcing belief, just allowing the possibility to sit in the room without immediately throwing it out. Then comes the fourth signature, the most haunting one, because it doesn't feel like curiosity or irritation or hesitation. It feels personal. The text calls it relevance resonance, the eerie sense that something was made for you. You're listening, and suddenly you realize the speaker is describing your inner experience with unsettling accuracy. Not your demographic, not your surface preferences, something deeper. The exact pattern you've been living, the exact loop you've been repeating, the exact question you've been carrying without saying it out loud. And in that moment, your rational mind scrambles to explain it away. It reaches for the obvious. It's generic. It's a common problem. They're good at psychology. It's just my projection. Sometimes those explanations are partially true, and still, they don't touch the core of the experience. You feel seen. And feeling seen is not always comforting. Feeling seen can feel like exposure. Because if something can name what you've been avoiding, you lose the hiding place of vagueness. You lose the ability to pretend you don't know what's going on. Relevance resonance comes with an unspoken pressure. Now that you recognize this, what are you going to do? This is why relevance resonance often triggers the strongest skip reflex. It's not that you dislike it. It's that it corners you gently. It places you at the edge of your own honesty. So now you have two forces moving at once. The pull signals drawing you toward the edge, and the inner alarms trying to pull you back. And right here is where the passage makes one of its most practical distinctions, because it prevents you from getting lost in the romance of all this. It separates ego-driven interest from soul-driven recognition. Ego-driven interest is comfortable. It feels validating. It feels like collecting ideas that fit your existing story. It feels like being right. It feels like staying in control while being entertained. Soul-driven recognition is not comfortable in the same way. It doesn't necessarily feel pleasant. It feels real. It creates a strange mixture of excitement and unease, like standing at the edge of something you can't unsee. And the difference matters, because the ego can be endlessly interested in things that never change your life. You can watch content, read books, gather concepts, talk about transformation, and still keep your behavior identical. The ego is brilliant at turning growth into identity decoration. But soul-driven recognition doesn't let you decorate. It destabilizes you just enough to create movement. Not because it's manipulating you, but because it's touching a truth you've been living around instead of living inside. So here is the skill, the one that turns this from mystical storytelling into something you can actually use. Watch your own reaction as data. When you feel magnetic curiosity, don't rush to label it meaningless. Ask what in your life is hungry for this. When you feel productive irritation, don't assume it means the message is wrong. Ask what assumption is being threatened. When you feel recognition hesitation, don't mistake the wobble for danger. Notice what part of you is trying to regain control. When you feel relevance resonance, don't panic and flee the exposure. Breathe and let yourself be seen, at least by yourself. None of this requires blind belief. It requires honesty about your inner signals. Because the pull signals are not proof of cosmic destiny. They're proof of readiness. They're proof that something in you has reached a point where the old way of living is no longer fully convincing. And the moment you admit that, the edge becomes visible, not as a cliff you're forced to jump from, but as a threshold you're approaching whether you want to admit it or not. You don't have to name it yet. You don't have to decide anything yet. But you can feel that you're being brought towards something, an opening, a choice point, a moment where staying the same starts to cost more than changing. And that's when the pull stops being a feeling and starts becoming a question. And that question, quiet, persistent, almost inconvenient, doesn't float in the air forever. It has a season. It has a window. There's a reason the pull feels urgent without being loud. It's not pressure from the outside. It's timing from within. Something in you has reached the edge of its old map. And the longer you stand there pretending you haven't, the more the ground begins to rearrange itself under your feet. This is the part people misunderstand when they talk about waiting until I'm ready. They imagine readiness as a clean, comfortable certainty that arrives like a signed letter. But real readiness is messy, eh? Real readiness feels like mismatch. Like wearing clothes that used to fit and suddenly don't. Except you're still wearing them, still trying to move through the day as if nothing is wrong. The discomfort is not a malfunction. It's the signal. It starts subtly, not with crisis, but with irritation toward what once felt normal. You wake up and the routine you used to run on autopilot feels strangely heavy. A job you could tolerate begins to feel like it's pressing on your chest. Conversations that used to entertain you now feel thin, like you're chewing air. You try to distract yourself with the old comforts, and they don't land the way they used to. They feel empty sooner. They don't feed you. This is not always depression. It's not always burnout. Sometimes it's a deeper kind of shift. Your inner frequency has changed, and your outer life is still calibrated to who you were. You can feel it in the smallest places. In the way you sigh before opening an inbox. In the way you look at your calendar and feel, for no rational reason, like you're staring at someone else's life. In the way you sit with people you've known for years and realize you're present, but something in you isn't participating. That's the first sign the passage calls out. The discomfort with routine. Not boredom. Not restlessness. A deeper revulsion. almost physical, toward a life that no longer matches you. It can be confusing because nothing bad has to happen for it to appear. The job might still pay. The relationship might still function. The structure might still look respectable from the outside. But inside, something has changed. And the old container begins to feel like a cage, not because it got smaller, but because you got larger. Then the second sign arrives, and this one scares people because it looks like loss. You start detaching. Not detaching as an act of superiority. Not detaching because you think you're better than anyone. Detachment as recalibration. The things that used to hook you, drama, gossip, the need to be approved of, the hunger to win, lose their flavor. You begin to notice that whole social environments run on frequencies you can't tune into anymore without strain. It's an odd sensation. You can love people and still feel distant from the way they move through life. You can sit in the same room and sense a gap, like your attention is in a different dimension. You might even feel lonely, not because you're alone, but because you've stopped feeding on what used to feed you, and you haven't yet found what feeds you now. This detachment can feel like something is being taken away, but often it's something being cleared. Your system is releasing attachments that were based on the older version of you. It's not punishing you by removing interest, it's making room. Like a forest shedding leaves before a new season. Like the tide pulling back before it changes shape. And then the third sign arrives. This one is unmistakable because it interrupts your autopilot. It breaks the trance. You start encountering patterns that feel like taps on the shoulder. Not dramatic miracles. Interruptions. A phrase that keeps appearing from unrelated sources. A concept that follows you. A conversation you overhear at the exact wrong time to be meaningless. A book title repeated by 3 different people. The same idea arriving from a podcast, a stranger, a sign, a memory, a dream. The interruption doesn't scatter you the way distraction does. It gathers you. It points. It says, gently but insistently, look here. This is the critical distinction. Distraction pulls you away from your life. Interruption pulls you deeper into it, into what matters, into what's unresolved, into what you've been avoiding. It feels like the universe is suddenly more responsive, but it might simply be that your awareness has become more sensitive to the way life has always been speaking. These 3 signs, routine, discomfort, detachment, interruptions, are not separate problems. They're a progression. They form a corridor. And if you walk that corridor consciously, the passage says the transition can be gentle. But if you keep trying to force yourself back into the old shape, if you keep treating the signals as inconvenient noise, the system escalates. This is where the mythology becomes sharply practical, almost unsentimental. Because Thoth, the measurer, is not describing fate as punishment. He's describing cause and effect. A pressure builds. A door opens. You either step through it, or the door eventually becomes a shove. Here's how it happens. A window appears. It might be small. A few weeks where you feel unusually clear. A month where you feel drawn toward a new skill, a new place, a different kind of life. A stretch of time when your nervous system seems to loosen its grip just enough for you to imagine change without immediately panicking. In those windows, the pull signals are stronger. The synchronicities are louder. The interruptions come in clusters. The sense of this matters has weight. And during those windows, you have access to courage you don't always have. Not courage as a personality trait, but courage as a state. A moment where your fear is still present, but no longer running the show. A moment when you can act before your conditioning reasserts its full authority. Most people don't realize those windows exist until they close. Because when the window is open, you assume it will remain open. You assume you can delay. You assume you can come back later. You treat the readiness as a mood rather than a phase. And then, quietly, the old patterns tighten again. The mind finds reasons. The body returns to baseline. The door that was slightly ajar becomes heavy. This is what the passage means by pivot points. Imagine your life as a river. Most days you're carried by the established current habits, obligations, familiar roles. Even when you think you're often choosing within a narrow channel carved by who you've been. But sometimes the river splits. There's a fork. One branch continues the familiar trajectory. The other branch leads into waters you can't fully predict. At those forks, the question is not, what do I want in theory? The question is, what can I no longer pretend is enough? Because pivot points don't appear when everything is working perfectly. They appear when your old operating system is no longer aligned with your emerging reality. That's why stuckness shows up as one of the most common triggers. You try what used to work, and it stops working. You push harder, and the results don't change. You feel as if life has become resistant, not because it's against you, but because the old strategy has reached its limit. Numbness is another trigger. Not dramatic sadness, but a dullness. Achievements that used to light you up feel like checking boxes. Practices that used to nourish you feel mechanical. You're not falling apart, you're flattening. And the flattening is a signal. Your consciousness is preparing to draw energy from a deeper source. But first it has to withdraw from what no longer feeds you. Then there's the resurgence of old patterns. Money fears, family dynamics, self-sabotage returning with an intensity that feels unfair. People often call it regression, but the passage frames it differently. Not a step backward, but an invitation to heal at a higher level. The pattern returns because you're finally strong enough to finish the work, not just manage it. And sometimes you sense a shift coming before you can name it. You feel drawn to new places, new skills, new ideas that don't fit your current plan. You can't explain it, but you can feel it. Preconscious awareness. Your deeper self recognizes the approaching fork before your mind can articulate what it means. These are not glitches. They are notifications. And if you respond to them, if you treat them as information rather than inconvenience, life often stays gentle. The discomfort becomes a guide. The detachment becomes spacious. The interruptions become a trail of breadcrumbs. But if you ignore them long enough, the passage warns of the final stage, disruption. Not because the universe is angry, because the system must realign you somehow. If you won't choose change voluntarily, change begins to choose you. The job you won't leave ends. The relationship you keep forcing breaks. Your body creates symptoms that slow you down. Your life reorganizes itself around the truth you've been avoiding. Disruption is not vengeance. It's intervention. It's the whisper becoming a shout because the whisper was consistently drowned out. It's the gentle knock becoming a forced entry because the door was never opened. It's the river pushing you into a new branch because you kept standing at the fork refusing to step. This is why distraction is described as more dangerous than darkness. Darkness at least forces reflection. Distraction keeps you perpetually shallow, busy, stimulated, always moving, never listening. It creates the illusion of living while postponing the decisions that would make your life real. So if you're in this corridor, if routine feels suffocating, if detachment is creeping in, if interruptions are clustering, don't treat it as a sign you're broken. Treat it as a sign you're arriving. Arriving at a pivot window, a time when your attention becomes magnetic, your defenses become louder, and your life begins to speak more clearly because you are finally capable of hearing. The question is not whether the fork exists. The question is whether you will respect the timing, whether you will move while the window is open, or wait until the system escalates the lesson into disruption. And the most honest way to know which direction matters is simple, and it's not mystical at all. Watch where your skip reflex flares. Watch where the pull signals persist. That intersection, the place where you're most tempted to flee and most unable to forget, is often the exact edge of the river where your life is asking you to choose. So if the river has split and you can feel the current tugging at two different directions inside you, the next question becomes painfully simple. What happens if you stop running? Not running from the outside world. Running from the moment where you'd have to admit you already know what you know. Because the most exhausting thing in a transition isn't the uncertainty. It's the double life. The way you keep one hand on the old identity while reaching for the new one. The way you try to negotiate with reality, as if you can change without anyone noticing, as if you can upgrade your life without upgrading your choices. That split creates static. It creates delay. It creates the feeling that you're always almost ready, but never moving. And this is where the old observation becomes sharp. When the seeker stops running, the path reveals itself. Not in a cinematic way, in a structural way. The moment your inner signal becomes coherent, when you stop broadcasting yes and no at the same time, life starts answering with the same kind of coherence. The fog doesn't lift because you forced it to. It lifts because you stopped generating it. The first thing that returns is clarity. Not the fantasy of perfect certainty, not the guarantee that nothing will hurt, not a 10-year plan with every detail solved. Clarity is simpler than that. It's the sudden end of spinning, the quiet collapse of mental loops that have been feeding on themselves for months, the recognition of what you are actually choosing when you keep delaying. People imagine clarity arrives through more thinking. It rarely does. It arrives when you stop arguing with what is already true in you. You know the difference the moment it happens. Decisions that felt impossible become obvious, not because you found new data, but because you stopped asking the wrong question. Instead of asking, how do I keep everyone happy? You start asking, what is real? Instead of asking, what's the safest option? You start asking, what is aligned? Instead of asking, how do I avoid regret? You start asking, what is the cost of staying? And the mind, so loud when it's defending an old structure, becomes strangely quiet when it no longer has to defend. It doesn't vanish. It just stops screaming. It stops producing 100 reasons for why you can't move, because the deeper part of you has already moved internally. This is why the discomfort stage can feel so torturous. It's not that you lack solutions. It's that you keep trying to use the old self to choose the new life. That never works for long. The old self will always choose what keeps it intact. But the moment you stop running, you stop negotiating with the old self as the final authority. You still care. You still consider consequences. You simply stop letting fear be the deciding vote. And then something else begins to happen that people often call luck because they don't have a better word for it. Alignment accelerates. Not because you're magically manifesting everything you want, but because you're no longer interfering with your own movement. You're not stepping forward with one foot and pulling back with the other. You're not asking for opportunities while secretly insisting nothing must change. You're not praying for a new chapter while clinging to the old page. When your internal state becomes coherent, your external world starts organizing around that coherence. It can feel sudden. A resource appears at the exact moment you need it. A conversation opens a door you didn't know existed. A person shows up who knows someone who has exactly the missing piece. An obstacle that held you in place for months dissolves in a week. Not because reality changed its rules, but because you finally met reality without contradiction. This is why, when people finally commit, truly commit, they often look back and realize the blockages were not only external. The blockages were also internal conditions. They were the price of staying half in, half out. The price of wanting change without wanting the loss that change requires. Because something does get lost when you stop running. You lose the fantasy that you can grow and keep everything the same. You lose the comfort of complaining without acting. You lose the ability to say, I don't know, when what you really mean is, I don't want to face what I know. And that loss is not a punishment. It's the removal of static. It's the clearing of a channel. So the synchronicities don't start as if the universe woke up today. They become visible because your attention stops being scattered. Your recognition becomes sharper. You begin to notice which encounters carry weight and which are just noise. You begin to choose differently, and those choices create different meetings, different timing, different consequences. The river shifts because you stepped into a different branch. And as that happens, the third transformation emerges, quietly at first, then with an unmistakable pull. Direction becomes clear, not as a pressure to hustle, not as a frantic need to prove yourself. Direction as a sense of rightness. Direction as an inner yes that doesn't require speech. There's a difference between ambition and direction. Ambition can be fueled by insecurity, by comparison, by fear of falling behind. It can create motion without meaning. Direction feels different. It has a steadiness. It's less about chasing and more about returning. You stop forcing yourself into roles that never fit, and you start moving toward what feels like home. That's why, when direction arrives, it often brings an unexpected peace alongside the fear. The fear doesn't disappear because consequences still exist, but the fear becomes manageable because the inner argument ends. You may still be nervous, but you're no longer confused about what matters. This is where the phrase gentle vigilance becomes essential, not as a spiritual slogan, but as a daily practice of maintaining the new frequency in ordinary life. Because after the first wave of clarity and alignment, the old patterns will try to return. Not because you failed, because your nervous system is loyal to familiarity. It will attempt to reinstall the baseline. It will offer you old distractions at exactly the moments when the new direction asks for consistency. It will suggest you should wait a little longer when the timing is actually now. It will offer you comfort in exchange for your integrity. Gentle vigilance is how you respond without turning your life into a war. You don't shame yourself. You don't become rigid. You simply notice the moment you're about to slip back into the old reflex, and you choose again. You choose the boundary. You choose the uncomfortable truth. You choose the small action that keeps your direction real. You choose to stay present instead of retreating into noise. This is also where the loneliness of transition begins to change shape. Because one of the quiet terrors of awakening is the sense that you're leaving people behind. Sometimes you are. Sometimes your frequency changes and certain connections cannot follow. That can hurt. It can feel like betrayal, even when no one did anything wrong. But the deeper truth is that coherence attracts coherence. As your direction becomes clearer, you begin to meet people who speak the language you're learning to speak. Not necessarily mystical people. People who are honest. People who are moving. People who don't require you to shrink to remain loved. And even within your existing circles, something shifts. When you stop running from yourself, you stop participating in unconscious patterns the same way. You stop feeding drama. You stop negotiating with disrespect. You stop pretending you're fine when you're not. That changes systems. Sometimes it creates friction. Sometimes it creates space. Sometimes it reveals which relationships were built on the old version of you. This is why the old teaching frames awakening as both personal and collective. Not because you must preach, not because you must fix anyone, but because a coherent person becomes a different kind of presence. You model what it looks like to move without chaos, to change without cruelty, to choose truth without turning it into an attack. That presence ripples outward, whether you intend it or not. And now, as you sit here, you can feel the entire arc tightening into one point. The skip reflex, the alarms, the whispers, the pull signals, the pivot window, all of it was pointing to a single moment. The moment you decide whether to keep fleeing the places that carry your next self. Because here is the most sobering line hidden inside the grandeur. The universe does not need your belief. It responds to your alignment. If you keep broadcasting contradiction, wanting change while clinging to the old identity, the river stays turbulent, the signals stay noisy, the path stays obscured. But the moment you stop running, the moment you let your attention become honest, reality begins to answer in the only language it has ever used. Pattern, timing, consequence, opening. And the opening is not a reward. It is the natural result of coherence. So if you're waiting for a sign that it's time, consider this. The sign is not only what appears around you. The sign is what is happening in you. The way your routine feels. The way your detachment has been growing. The way interruptions have been clustering. The way you've been pulled toward what you keep trying to dismiss. The question isn't whether you're at a threshold. The question is whether you're willing to stop running long enough to step through it. Take one slow breath and notice what your body does when you imagine scrolling away from this. Not the thoughts, not the arguments, just the sensation. Does something loosen with relief? Does something tighten with regret? That tiny difference is more honest than any explanation you can give yourself. You don't need to dramatize this. You don't need to announce a new identity. You don't need to burn down your life to prove you're evolving. The next step is usually smaller than your fear makes it. It's often a single conversation you've avoided, a boundary you've delayed, a page you need to write, a habit you need to stop feeding, a quiet decision to treat your attention as sacred again. If you want a simple practice, make space for one recognition window today. 5 minutes. No phone. No performance. Just sit and notice what keeps returning to your mind. Notice what your attention keeps orbiting. Notice what you keep postponing, even though it won't let you go. Then ask one question, without forcing an answer. What am I protecting myself from? Don't hunt for cosmic proof. Look for practical alignment. If the message is real, it will ask for a real response. If the pull is real, it will point toward action that restores integrity, not action that inflates fantasy. And if the resistance rises the moment you consider that action, don't treat it as failure. Treat it as confirmation that you're near the edge of something meaningful. Stay with the discomfort long enough to choose. Choose gently, but choose. Because the path doesn't reveal itself to the person who is entertained by it. It reveals itself to the person who stops running long enough to walk. If you've made it this far, don't let the skip reflex take the last word. Choose one small act of coherence right now. Drop a comment with this phrase. I stop running. I choose the next step. Let it be your signal to yourself that you recognize the pull, named the resistance, and stepped through the window while it was open.